The wind tore through the barren plain, dry and merciless, and the house stood like a stubborn thing against it, one hand's width of light in a wide, cold country. He lived alone, as he meant to, with his work laid out in neat, honest rhythms. Wood split, fence mended, stove kept fed, a horse fed and brushed. Days were measured in the weight of routine. He rose with the city of pale sun and went to bed with the black that took the hills. His name had been called in town a few times, and acquaintances passed in the spring with easy words, but he had learned a way of keeping his inside smaller than the world. His shoulders had the habit of carrying what had to be carried and no more. The land accepted that and answered with steady, rough returns. He rarely spoke. He had a grave on the hill for a dead son and a memory that fit into the work of his hands like a splinter he could not pull but had learned to bear. He had not expected to change, not much, not after the freeze that took so much and the years that hollowed him out. Then, in the town that lay at the edge of the river, she came like a thing that had been worn thin and kept trying to wear something hopeful underneath. She stood by a post as if the wood could hold her upright, her coat threadbare and damp at the edges. Her hair was pinned back with a small, careful hand. A child clung to her skirt, small and fevered, cheeks raw from cold, eyes too bright or too blank to read. They were the kind of people townsfolk pointed at in a way that hid the pointing behind laughter. A man with a heavy laugh made a joke about trade and value. Another offered a coin for a story. The sheriff pretended not to see the hunger in the child's hands. The girl kept looking at the ground. Her voice had the soft edge of someone who had learned to wear silence for protection. When the auction man rattled out names like grain from a sieve, she leaned toward him with a question she had practiced in 1,000 sleepless nights. "Can you take her instead of me?" she asked, because barter and choices had been the grammar of her days. She meant take my place. Let her live. The crowd knuckled its cheap morals at the sound. The sheriff chuckled. The man who traded in broken lives saw more dollars than dignity. He said nothing at first. He had come to town for supplies and to trade a bale of hay and to listen without meaning to listen. He stood at the back, his coat pulled tight, his hands empty and used to being that way. When the girl asked that, the wind seemed to catch the words and hold them like dust in the sunlight. He had his own habit of looking away from asking faces. The hollow was near his own ribs, and it hurt to stare. But the child's small hand closed on her skirt. The child's breath fogged in the air. The collar looked like a hawk set to take. It was wrong in a way that woke a different thing in him, a memory he had not named, and a sharpness that came from guilt and from loss and from an old promise made to a slow, tired sky. He felt an impulse like a muscle twitch. He pushed through the crowd. He bought them. He did not speak. He took coin from his pocket the way he had taken responsibility for the weather, without speeches, without show. He paid what was asked. The exchange was a strange and quiet thing. The auction man with his practiced smile, the girl with a choked relief, the child who blinked at the light like an animal not used to being fed. People looked at him as one looks at a cloud that has appeared out of nowhere. They shifted their weight away. Some nodded as if he had done charity and not made it personal. He should have felt like a hero or ashamed, or at least like someone who had been pulled into a story. He felt like a man who had kept a promise to someone who no longer answered. He led them away on a path that smelled of coal tar and late smoke. They did not speak. The girl, who had asked to be taken, kept her head down. The child clung to her hand as if that touch were the only warmth in a world that had given up on heat. He walked in front, the horse behind, and the clop of hooves and the creak of saddles made the measured sound of leaving. He gave the girl his coat on the road, and she took it as if it had been a new law. She tried to say thank you and could only let the word tremble into the wind. He had not intended to bring anyone home. He had not intended to change the shape of his days, but he had not intended to keep thinking about the girl's face as he rode back through the open country, either. There were times when doing the right thing was simply what one did. The house had its small, stubborn comforts. A firewood heap leaning like a patient animal. 2 plates in the cabinet by accident, the second one an old thing with a hairline crack that made it feel like the house was ready for 2. The child took to the place as children do, with an appetite for rooms and things and the earnestness of someone making a new map. The girl watched him work. She unfolded herself slowly into the routines, but something in her from the town had been bruised beyond the easy mending of chores. She did not make easy trust. She measured the space between them with the same care she measured coins. He kept his distance like one keeps a lantern from damp. He cooked, awkward but steady. He left an extra cup of coffee by the stove, the steam like a small, unspoken invitation. He mended the child's boots with a patience that went beyond good manners. At night he would sit by the stove and listen to her breathe as if learning the geography of someone else's bones. He had a way of moving that said he cared without giving the page over to speech. Days ran into each other under the old roof. He taught the child to sew a loose button and to hold a cup steady. The child responded with the bluntness of hunger met. The girl, who had been so ready to trade herself away, began, in a small and wary way, to reclaim pieces of herself. She hung a scrap of cloth on a nail and made a small bed by the stove for the child, stuffing the mattress with dry straw like a priest who keeps one small altar clean. Her hands were clever with work. Her eyes were quick to notice a leaky pan or a draft. She would not bridge the space between them with words. She did it with motions, with the soft language of tending. He watched. He watched until watching became a kind of craving. He found himself building a little cradle with his own hands, working late into the night, the lamp smoky and the boards creaking beneath a pair of boots that had been kept from talking for a long time. He did not say why. He did not tell her there was a grave on the hill or how the nights had felt heavier since the boy had gone. He did not tell her that the good habit of giving his coat to someone else came from an old regret. Small gestures collected like stones on the table between them. She watched them pile up, suspicious and searching for a catch. She expected a condition. She expected to be sent away when the man who bought them felt lighter. Time went on and the town kept its opinions. People said things at the post office and at the saloon. The man who had bought them walked into town for supplies with both hands in his pockets and his hat low. He ignored the looks. He paid in coin and not in words. He moved like someone who does not look back because looking back will only show the empty space where a man once stood beside him. The child learned to call him by the name he had been given and then, one night, in a breath like someone deciding to live in a moment rather than survive it, to call him by something softer. The girl watched the change with a guarded joy, as if a door had cracked open a little and it might close again. They kept to the rules of living in such places. No talk of the worst things, no sudden promises. The child grew warmer and thinner, things mended. The girl's hands grew less nervous about the way she moved in the house. The weather was fierce that winter, and storms came down from the gray and wrapped the world in a blanket of white. The man kept fires going longer, sat up later, listened to the child's breath and the girl's soft humming while she scrubbed a pan. He did not speak of his past, but sometimes at dusk he would go up the hill to the grave and sit for a long time, the wind cutting at his cheeks, and feel the small closeness of a name under the ground. He began to find, in his small acts, a reason to mend not only broken things but also the thinnest measure of trust the girl gave. She trusted him not because he said he would be there but because he was where things could be counted on. One afternoon, when the sky had the pale face of the sky before a storm, she walked into town for flour. He watched her go from the porch and felt the old hollow open as her figure left the line of sight. People in town had not yet forgotten the bargain, and not everyone forgave the change of ownership in others. She was stared at, as if the coat he had given her marked her as someone with a price. A man at the general store called out that women get in trouble by their charms. A woman spat at her shoes on the street. The girl's jaw set like a thing that would not be broken. The child clung tighter to her hand and dragged at the fabric of her skirt. The man waited by the door of the saloon, knowing that even the sight of her passing could turn gentle townsfolk into the opinion of wolves. He was slow to anger. He had little use for loud fights. But he had also lived with a private stubbornness that would not be stepped on. He followed her without plan. He kept his hat down and his posture like a man who meant to be unremarkable. When the mocking words turned to a shove, when a heavy-lidded man with a flush on his face decided to make an example of her. The world tightened into the cold, hard focus it took for a man to act. He moved so that his shadow ached into that of the chuckler. He stepped between them quietly. He did not shout. He did not draw a gun. He put his hand on the arm of the man who pushed her and moved him back with a force that was more a landline than a temper. He said a single thing then, which was not his habit. "She's with me." The town fell silent as if a bell had rung. The words held kind of a claim the mercenary had no right to make, but which he meant with the whole of him. The man who had shoved her scoffed something that sought to humiliate. The crowd lined around them like dry grass around a lash of lightning. Her face tightened and then, because shame will go thin and hope thick on the same day, she looked at him with an odd, bright something that might have been gratitude or surprise. The child, pale with fright, buried his small face into her apron. A woman in the back whispered that he had no business, that a man shouldn't. The wrongness of such words fell on the man's ears like pebbles. He had been built by a land that did not hold men soft. He held the man who had shoved her with the simplest machinery of presence. Unblinking, unmoved. No drama.
No flairist.
The world had seen him as a man who had nothing to give but work. Now he had given himself something that could not be sold or traded. A place. The crowd took it into their mouths and chewed it for a bit before spitting it out. There were those who smiled and called him soft in their heads and those who disapproved in the same tone. People make up stories for what they do not understand. He carried the woman and the child home under a sky that was getting the look of night. The wind had taken the last of the sun with it and left the plain raw and honest. She did not thank him at first. There were other things to do. She fed the child. She tended the fire. She put an extra blanket on the bed. She kept her back to him as if the act of turning might show a crack he could take advantage of. At night she stood by the stove and cried softly into her palms. Not loud, not dramatic. An exhausted sound like a bird settling on a branch after a long flight. He heard her and sat nearby. He did not say anything. The child slept, finally, with a small sound like a boat finding harbor. The house felt smaller with that smallness in it. He set a cup of unpoisoned coffee beside her hand and did not move any closer than necessary. She touched the cup as if testing whether kindness would burn her too. The next days slipped into a new kind of habit where neither spoke of the town. Their world narrowed to what was necessary. He would wake early and patch the fence. She would find a way to make what food they had go a little further. They fell into a rhythm of understanding in small gestures, of work as an address book where each motion spelled out the other. He began to talk with his fingers and with his tools. He taught the child to whistle with a small bone and the child learned it under the girl's careful eye and then the whole house whistled at the same time like three birds at once. He did not think in grand terms. He thought in bread and in wood and in whether the roof would hold through the next storm. But under the steady, small acts something like a change was growing inside him. Not loud, not obvious, but like a slow warming under frost. One night, when the wind had been bad and the roof sang with the strain of it, the child woke hot and shaking. Fever, the girl said in a voice small as a bone. He boiled water with hands that were steady because his mind was like a carpenter's plane, set to remove only the splinters. He held the child and felt the small heat against his chest. The girl's hands shook as she folded a cool rag across the child's brow. They moved as if they had been in a play all their lives and were only now learning the lines. He sat with them and thought of the grave on the hill and of a lullaby that had been taught to an infant a long time ago, the words of which had been taught to him by a woman whose face returned to him in the dreams he would not speak of. He hummed without thinking, low and rough, and the child quieted, the sound of a moment finding a form that did not need to be named. The girl looked at him then with the kind of look people reserve for sacred things. It was not worship. It was recognition. The night storm eased at dawn like someone blowing out a troubled lamp. The child slept through, breathing in a soft, even way, the fever broken by care and the stubbornness of life. She set the child's hand in his and let it rest there. She did not say thank you then, either. She did not need to. Her eyes said what her mouth would have been clumsy to say. The offer she had made in town, to take the child in place of herself, had been an act of economy and of love. It had been also a litmus test of a world that thought it could buy or sell the worth of people by how much they fit a pocket. He did not say why he bought them because he did not like speeches. He had reasons no one would have believed and a guilt no coin could lift. He did not need them to know all of them. He needed them to be alive, and it was enough. The middle of the winter became a long, steady walk of small things. Waking, feeding, fixing. The girl's suspicions softened like frost at noon. She began to tell small stories, first of how she had learned to mend socks on a night so hungry the moon looked like bread. Then of the child she had once known who had a laugh like bells. He listened. He asked no questions that pried. Once, when she spoke of leaving town long ago to find work and finding only harder work and harder losses, he looked away and his chin filled with the way men keep the sea from washing their feet. He had learned to say less because it was safer that way. But sitting in the kitchen with the stove between them and the child sleeping, he touched her hand with a casualness that was the most deliberate thing he had done in years. She let her fingers lie there, and for an hour they read the small print that the world had left unwritten. Then town gossip came like rain. A man who had called himself a friend of the old ways came by and tried to reduce the thing they had built to a joke. He said she would get more than she deserved. He said the man had a soft streak that would wane. He moved like a gambler at a table he had already lost. The girl, who had been so ready to offer herself away, had a fresh fierceness now. She stepped forward as if to fight. The man laughed, which is to say he threw something cheap into the air and hoped it would land like a crown. The child watched with eyes wide as if this were a lesson about the animality of grown men. The man who had bought them stepped between them again. He did not raise his voice. He did not do what the crowds wanted, blow and bluster and make a scene. He stood like a wall. He said again, "She's with me." It was not just a phrase. It was a deed. The man who had occupied that town with his opinions frowned and then, because some people cannot imagine that a man will do for others what he has not done for himself, found a new sneer. He spat an accusation that would have been murder in some places. The cowards in the corners laughed. The town divided itself into edges. She watched him then with a look that broke his habit of being alone. She stepped toward him and took off her glove and laid it in his hand. Not a demand but a gift. He held it like a thing he had not deserved and did not know how to wear. They went home with the road quieter than before, the air full of a kind of brittle peace. He had taken both. She had asked for one. The child would not let the newness of safety go untested. At night the child would wake and cry for a mother who had left years before, and she would hush him back to sleep with hands that had been hardened by work and softened by tenderness. The middle of the story is where the ordinary miracles happen. A bowl of soup held long enough for someone to eat in peace, a boot fixed without comment, a song hummed at dusk that ached in the right way. He moved around them not out of duty but because he had begun to want to be the place they returned to. It was nothing loud. It was kitchen air and the small, ordinary music of two people learning that survival could become living. The house, once a shelter for one, began to be a house that held more than a skeleton of a man's life. He laid the child's small shoe on the windowsill to dry and sometimes found a scrap of fabric folded neatly where his gloves had been. He began, without deciding to plan for a future that had both of them in it. He repaired the porch swing he had once meant to leave for no one. He carved small shapes in the wood when he felt the ache of the past press up like a bone. There were nights when he lay awake and thought of the grave on the hill, and what that man would say if he saw a house filled with the brightness of a child and the careful competence of a woman. Then he would breathe and let the thought go like ash in a wide wind. The middle did not erase what had been. It only added new layers to it. Around them the country kept its big hard truths. The frost, the hunger preceding spring, the way some people never changed their faces. But inside the house a different weather took hold, one made of small mercies. It was slow and stubborn and nothing like the firework heroics of a tale told to thrill a tavern. It was the kind of thing that, given time, becomes a life. The first thaw came slow and treacherous, the kind that pretends mercy while it loosens the ground and makes honest work twice as hard. The roof dripped in honest rhythm across the kitchen hearth. Daylight pulled through the glass like a pale promise. They moved around each other with the easy economy of a place long shared. She setting water on to warm while he hefted a pail of snowmelt from the barrel, the child at her skirt tying a rope of rag dolls to a stick, pronouncing each name with solemn importance. It was not yet talk of futures, only the small machinery of mornings, the quiet rituals that build a life without fanfare. He watched them between chores, hands still smelling of sap and soot, and felt a softness that surprised him. It had weight, it had gravity, and it pulled him away from the slope of the grave more often than he would have expected. The town talk did not stop with winter. News always finds a way to travel along boot heels and the seams of coats. It liked to wedge itself in corners where people waited for a reason to look important. Some brought their heads low, pretending propriety. Some brought jokes with teeth. A farmer he had once traded with crossed the main street one spring afternoon and spat where she could not miss it. A woman who had watched the auction and thought herself witty made a sound like a bird with a broken wing when she saw them together on the ridge road. The man took no pleasure from it, but he had learned to wear ridicule as a second coat. Stiff, protective. He kept a steady eye on the horizon and on the shovel. There came a day when that coat was not enough. A stranger rode into town, his hat broad and his horse heavy with the smell of a distant county. He carried the look of wealth in that way the town recognized. New buckles, stitching not worn by many hands, a thin talk and a thick appetite. He asked questions that were small and precise. Who owned what, who tilled which acre, who would sell for the right coin. He made his way to the shop and lingered by the back tables where men repaired harness. He watched the woman one noon when she came for a pan of flour. He smiled at her as if she were a curiosity he might keep. The girl at her side clung a little closer, eyes wide. He made offhand offers, low enough to awake hope and high enough to sting. The town held its breath in the kind of way towns do when old small cruelties think they can become new harm. When the man heard, he did what he did best. He lined up the wood and shoveled the snow and walked into town as if to fetch nails or bolts, though his hands wanted nothing of shops. He walked with the weight of a man who has been forced to think before he speaks, or rather, who thinks in the space where words used to be. He watched the stranger from the post office window, watched him tilt his hat and speak as if the woman were a chest of goods. He felt something go hard inside him, not quite anger, not quite the old surge of grief, but an animal resolve to stand something down with his own silence. He did not make a scene. He did not raise his voice. He went to the stable and asked for oats, paid with his steady coins as if he had always intended to buy what he needed there, and when he passed the stranger in the lane he said only, "She's with me." It was not a boast and it was not a plea. It was a small, immovable truth. The stranger laughed the laugh of men who think money ends argument. He shuffled forward and, with the casualness of the practiced bully, put his hand to the woman's wrist as if to steer her where he fancied. The child backed away, eyes large with that instinctual fear of grown men who move like storms. The man's hand closed on the stranger's arm like iron. When the other tightened his grip to test the weather, the man gave nothing back but weight and presence. He turned the stranger toward the sun, edged him down the road until the horse snorted and the rider found his hat less steady. The town had expected a fight or a ruckus. It received a quiet exodus. The stranger left on a horse that had been ridden enough to have no complaint left, and the town settled like dust back into the unfinished work of the day. That night the woman boiled broth and added the herbs the man kept for simple fevers. She moved with a steadier hand now, her back less bent, the way one stands a fraction more upright when a neighbor offers an unmistakable shield. By the lamp she told a piece of her story. Not the first details, those were still a guarded place, the kind of room in a house that locks for privacy. She told of a brother who had gone to the river and drowned his luck in drink, of a mother who had left abruptly and never returned, of the town's laugh that had grown a habit of pointing at quieter people. The man listened. He said nothing, but when she paused, caught by a memory that scraped, he moved a chair closer and set his hand on the edge of the table, as if to hold the space open. She looked at him then, and for the first time not with the cautious eyes of someone measuring a possible savior, but with the softer, fiercer gratitude of someone who has been kept safe without asking. The child's recoveries were small miracles. Fever fell away in the space of a night. Laughter returned like a bird landing on a fence, casual and indisputable. He learned to name things and then to manage the names. He learned the chores that fit small hands and, more importantly, the small courtesies that fit grown ones. The woman taught him to sew a seam, to tie a knot that would not slip. The man taught him how to throw a line that would not catch where it ought not. They took to the rhythm of days with the steadiness of people who, having been tossed enough, prefer the predictable to dramatic turns. The man found himself filling in the holes around his days with the kind of details that had been empty since his wife's hair stopped rising in the morning light. A boiled egg at the right time, a hand to steady when the ladder creaks, a blanket to tuck when the wind comes like a biting memory. Spring softened the hills. The grave remained on the rise like a folded thought. He visited it sometimes with the woman at his side, sometimes with the child in his arms, and those visits changed him. At first he carried a single hand across the marker and spoke into the marrow as men do, in short sentences and harder eyes. Later he brought seeds and placed them in the ground around the stone, a small rebellion against the permanence of absence. Once, standing there with the woman, he admitted, if that is the word for such a thing, that the boy had been his map. Without him, he had wandered. The woman leaned her shoulder to his and rested her forehead for a moment against the top of his head. They stood like two people who now knew grief could be shared without being halved. The child played a small game of burying and finding acorns, solemn as any officiant, and when he laughed the sound took the hill as if it had a right to be there. Summer brought more work than either expected. The land needed tending. The man had the marrow of a farmer, or at least the hands of one who could coax stubborn things into life. They planted a small garden, potatoes in straight rows, beans that fussed themselves along poles, and 2 tomato plants whose fruit he bought small and green in the spring market. It seemed a foolish pleasure to an outsider, the way some men spend coin on music when roofs leak, but it became their measure. The woman tended the herbs and mended clothes with patience and a careful eye. The child carried water in an overturned pail and learned to fetch, to kneel, to hold the horse's reins without letting go. The man sat on the porch in evenings and watched the 3 of them move through the land. His hands did not stop. They found new kinds of work, fixing a fence that would not hold, fashioning a new cradle foot, oiling the hinges on the kitchen door. Each small task stitched the 3 into something that looked very much like a family. Then the land brought them a trial that had nothing to do with wind or frost. The stranger returned, not on the same horse or with the same reckless grin, but with an intent made of coin and smarm. He had found a partner in a man who owned a stretch of lowland, land that had once been offered to the man's family before his tragedy. They came into town with ledgers and names and offered contracts that were easy to sign if you were new to the world but heavy when read aloud. They wanted to claim a sliver of land the man had always thought his by custom if not by title. They named it as an expansion of their holdings. The town council, full of men who liked the feel of being important, called a meeting. They called for names and deeds. In the back, someone spoke of trades, of what belongs to whom. Rumors of court had a way of dressing themselves up in the same colors as rightness. He went to the meeting because that is where men whose lives have been folded by loss learn to stand. The woman came too, not out of any thought to make spectacle, but because she had learned the plain honor of standing beside people who bore the same sun. The child came and sat on the floor among the dust and the knees of men. The stranger and his partner pushed forward with contracts and lawyers' words, and when they lifted their eyes their gaze found the woman. They gave the council a tale of how they had offered to buy her services, and that she had declined due to some romantic entanglement with the man. Laughter, thin and sharp, rose like glass. The council, which liked tidy answers, looked to the man for clarity. He did not give them drama. He gave them a single unadorned truth. He had built a home, and the woman and child were part of it. He spoke of mornings and of the child's namelessness before they found him, of the meals set out at dawn and the bread that rose because hands tended it. He told them nothing of the grave on the hill. He did not need to. The weight of his life was enough. They tried to shame him with questions he could not answer easily. They asked for proof, for a title, for some paper that said he owned what his hands showed. He answered not with words but by standing upright, shoulders squared in a way that had not belonged to him for years. The stranger derided him and reached for a tone that would make him small. The man's hands were steady. His eyes did not wander. He told them, simply, that this was his home and that they would not take it. A few men on the council who had once, in the odd way of human sympathies, owed him small favors shifted their weight to the other side. The stranger's partner suggested a legal action. The town murmured about what could be done. The woman looked at the man then, her lips pressed into a line that held many things, fear and a small, fierce pride. The child took a biscuit from his pocket and offered it to a boy in the corner who had been taught to laugh at other people's misfortunes. The boy, who had never known the slow work of kindness, took it reluctantly and then ate it with the kind of hunger that says more about training than appetite. Silence fell like a blanket. The council adjourned, the lawyers talking of dates and depositions and the long, expensive wilderness of court. They were not without power, these men with papers and purses. Power suits and town bylaws creep in like vines. Papers were filed. Men came to look over the land with measuring rods and maps, declaring boundaries with the cold precision of instruments that care little for who has planted potatoes for 3 summers. The first notice arrived on crisp paper, the kind of thing sewn up in town to make things feel formal. It said the man must vacate a parcel by a certain time. The man read it once, folded it, and put it into a chest with nails and spare rope. He did not go to the town to argue. He walked instead to the field and sat on his plow. He watched the sky and the movement of clouds across the ridge like a private council. The woman set seed potatoes apart and tucked them into cool, dark earth. The child watched from the porch and drew lines in the dust as if mapping where the house would be when no one came with papers. The day the men came to mark the fence, a different thing happened. They arrived with the weight of officialdom and the clumsy certainty of men who believe rulers and maps are the final arbiters of right. They began to drive posts into the line where a paper claimed the boundary would be, forcing a straightness that did not match the slope of the land. The man stood by as they worked, his hands tucked into his coat, and after a time, when a board was hoisted in place that might eat the corner of his kitchen garden, he walked across the field and set his tools down. He picked up a hammer and started to mend a post the men had already set. Simple act. A man marrying his labor to the world. One of the measuring men approached him and told him, with the thin politeness of a man who owns a ledger, to stop. The man kept hammering. He nursed the post straight with a steady hand. The measuring man put down his ruler and came close, voice climbing that scale into reprimand. The man looked at him and then at the child who had come to watch. The child's face crumpled with quiet worry. The man's jaw set and he turned to leave. Then he stopped. He placed the hammer on the post and took up the measuring man's sleeve with both hands. He did not hit him. He steered him instead, away, and when the official stumbled for a while like a man jolted out of his script, he found the road. The strangers mounted and rode, ashamed to find the road less their own than they had expected. They left the survey flagged, but their steps were uneven. They did not press the matter into violence after that. Perhaps the town, which enjoys gossip more than granting wounds, decided that a tussle would be poor advertisement for its moral code. Perhaps the men with papers thought any fight might reveal the smallness they feared. Either way, the legal notices continued, the letters exchanged, the whispering that was not open talk. They asked the man to sell. They offered coin that could raise roofs and build barns. They even suggested a trade for other acreage. He listened and shook his head. He did not say much, but one morning very early, he took the child to the hill. They stood before the grave and the man reached down and dug with his hands a small hole near the stone. And when the child looked to him for reason, he said only, "A place to plant things for the summer." It was not a speech. It was a decision. Summer moved into life and, as if in answer to the stubbornness of small human beings, the garden thrived with a stubbornness of its own. Tomatoes swelled with the thick red patience of good weather. Beans climbed their poles with a determined thirst. The child's laughter threaded through the days like a note kept well. The woman brought a shyness toward the man that was softer now than in winter, and he began, in his careful way, to respond. He showed her how to make a stout row of stitches that would hold through washing. She reminded him how to make the jam that required precise watching. The child taught him the names of birds. They mended each other's mistakes with the unspoken courtesy of people who know a wrong can be smoothed with honest work. When a stranger from town came by to sell a horse they really could not trust, the man said nothing but the horse's gait and eyes spoke enough. He did not buy it, for it was not the right fit for the land or the life, but he listened with that patient attention that has the force of speech. The courthouse days came. The calendar was not an animal to be cajoled. It marched as it wished. They had a lawyer who charged as lawyers do, steadily, and spoke legal Latin with a tone that suggested the past belonged properly on paper. In court, the questions were formal and dry. The stranger and his partner produced paper and measurement and county records and a map that looked like a neat apology for dispossession. The man presented what he could. Sworn testimony from neighbors who had seen him there for years, receipts from purchases, the testimony of small kindnesses by people who had once borrowed his plow. The woman sat in the back and watched the man. Her hands found his in a way she had not permitted herself in public before. Fingers curling into calloused palms as if to anchor herself to a truth she had not known she could own. The judge, a man who had read law in a town with a low river and a higher sense of propriety, looked at them all with a slow, judicial patience. He weighed paper against presence. He knew, in ways that charts couldn't quantify, how often life is written in the slant of a rake mark or the neatness of a planted row. The ruling was narrow and generous and the sort of thing that falls like weather. The man kept his homestead. The judge's opinion was long and dry, and had the curious habit of saying that the equities favored those with long-standing possession when the land was lawless to begin with. It was not a triumph so much as a formal recognition of what the earth had already decided, that people who live on the land and put their hands to its care are not easily removed by contracts written in other people's ink. The courtroom leaked out into a town suddenly quiet with relief. Some men who had mocked him now stared at their own boots while other neighbors, who had once accepted the man's distance, nodded as if an omission had been righted. The woman exhaled in the doorway like someone letting a breath find space after being pinched. The child bounced on his heels, not understanding the legalities but understanding that the house would remain and that the garden would not be ruined. They walked home under a sky that held the day's long shadows like a benediction. Nothing in that victory changed the small work of love. If one could have measured tenderness, it would have been found in the mending of a shirt sleeve, in the way a biscuit was set out on a plate without comment, in the spare chair that had once been empty now occupied by another pair of hands. The man learned to ask small questions that opened up larger answers. She learned to stay for the quiet parts of the day when nothing spectacular happened. Sometimes when the child slept, they would sit on the porch and count the stars in the way some folks count their blessings. Slow, careful, a thing to be done when noise has gone away. Once, on an evening when the moon had a small proud split across it, the woman took the man's hand and said, quietly, "I didn't think I could be wanted." He did not answer with great words. He lifted her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles. An old, careful gesture of a man who has learned the measure of language by living it out. She smiled, small and private, and her eyes filled with something that had been patched together by hope. The child grew. He learned to call the man by a name that had the kind of clumsy reverence children make for grown people who feed them and steady them. The man did not correct the name. He accepted it as if it were a new map anyone could read. The three of them moved through seasons with a kind of plodding joy. On the hill, the stones wore kinder angles. The man sometimes lay awake thinking of the son whose grave he tended and felt the old knife of absence. Then he would get up and go to the window and watch the woman teaching the child to swing a hammer. Sometimes he would go to the grave and spread a handful of garden seeds around the stone and think of things planted that might take their time to show. The woman's stories came in fits and patches. Shadows turned to light, small admissions of how she had been forced to make shelter out of nothing. He told her of the boy who had taught him to milk cows and who had once called him father with a reckless certainty that never left the grove of his memory. She listened without pity and with the kind of respect that honors wounds without trivializing them. Rumors abetted, but they did not vanish because towns do not easily give up their stories. New children were born to other houses. Old arguments restarted over the distance between the church and the mill. Yet when a man whose boots were new from town found himself in a scrape and needed a hand, he walked to the porch of the man's house and received one. People learned to drop off bread and tools and to ask for nothing more than a cup of tea. The child, now taller and with a certain crookedness in his grin, served biscuits with impunity and became the small, unassailable monarch of the yard. The woman taught the neighbors how to make a jam that made even the most anxious woman set her jaw into satisfaction and go home with a jar. The man, who had once spoken sparingly, discovered that the world prized steadiness in ways words couldn't show. He began to tell small stories at market about the weight of barns and the way moons look when you are up early. Time does what seasons do, it bends. One autumn afternoon, when the light slanted and the house smelled of stew and cedar, the man took the woman's hand and led her to the hill. The child's small boots crunched in the frostbitten grass. He carried a small rough box he had made himself, sanded and stained by his hands. The woman watched him with the look of someone waiting for a gentleness she had nearly forgotten to expect. He knelt before the grave and opened the box. Inside lay a small handkerchief and the carved foot of a small cradle he had made the summer the boy died, a piece he had never managed to put to its use. He set it on the ground and then began, slowly, almost awkwardly, to speak of the boy whose laugh had once filled that home. He said the name aloud as if to send it rolling again into the world. He spoke of how grief had been his lonely map and how, by unexpected patience, he had navigated back to a place where hope could be kept in the open. The woman put her head against his shoulder. The child, who had been making maps in the dirt, came up behind and pressed his small face, all earnestness, to the man's cheek. The man felt then the capacity of the heart he had thought long dead. He felt it expand like a field after rain. He had made a home on the bones of sorrow, and it had grown into something that sheltered more than himself. He had learned how to be loved without being demanded upon, and how to demand love without putting chains upon it. He placed the handkerchief on the stone and then, in an act so quiet as to be nearly private, he untied a small knotted rope and buried the carved foot. It was an offering and an acceptance, a way of saying his son had not been forgotten, but that life had kept its promise to move forward. They returned to the house and sat by the stove as evening fell. The child lay with his head in the woman's lap and slept to the rhythm of the floorboards creak. The man boiled tea and poured it into cups that matched the depth of their modest fortunes. They spoke in slow sentences, sometimes only gestures, and the world felt both fragile and resoundingly solid. They had been tested and their answers had been to keep working, to keep standing, to keep feeding. The grave on the hill became not an accusation but a neighborly thing, a reminder of what had been lost and the care due to it. Years make their soft, unrogable changes. The house gathered small improvements, a step that didn't groan, a fence mended not by necessity but by pleasure. The garden expanded to hold squash and a row of carrots that the child tended like a tiny hero to be celebrated. The woman learned to read the weather like a woman who had waited for sun her whole life. The man grew the way people do who have been given one more season, slower to anger, quicker to generosity. They became people who could ask for help without shame and offer it without showing that they had once needed it. The town stopped thinking of them as an oddity and began, as towns do, to fold them into the pattern of ordinary days. On an evening when the first frost glittered like a promise not to forget, the man sat again by the grave. He watched the outline of the house against the dimming sky. A light here, a shadow there. Knowing now that missing someone does not mean one can never love another. He felt, in that small, steady pulse of a life nearly mended, a softness like forgiveness turned toward itself. He rose and walked back to the house where the woman had already set 2 cups of tea by the hearth. The child ran to him, breathless with a joy that knew no bar. They sat together and listened to the house settle around them, to the wind make its small music through the chimneys. When the wind eased, the man placed a hand on the woman's and she did not flinch. She laid her head on his shoulder the way someone sleeps against a steady wall. They did not need to speak. The child, safe and warm between them, drew a breath and slept on. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. The grave on the hill remained a private thing, watched over and spoken to in the low language of memory, but it did not keep him from the world. He had learned, in the slow business of days, that one can carry sorrow and also carry a cup of tea to another's hand. He watched the light change on the porch and felt the small, honest swelling of something like contentment. The house kept them warm, and the work kept them honest, and the quiet, when it came, was a thing loved rather than feared. They lived on, not in the flash of a single great event, but in the continued humility of shared chores, mended seams, salted meat for winter, and the steady, patient planting of seeds that would one day feed hungry mouths. They stayed.